Hi, welcome back. Today we shall be reading Chapter 53, The Destroyer of Evil. The wind is too strong, murmured a worried Tara, looking at the windsock that had been set up close to the Vayuputras Astra missile tower. Tara and Shiva were mounted on horses, stationed far from the Vayuputras Astra launch tower. It was almost the end of the second prahar, and the sun was just a few moments away from being directly overhead. Shiva's entire army and the refugees from Devagiri had been cordoned off 7 kilometers from the launch tower, safely outside the Vayuputras Astra's blast radius. Shiva glanced at Tara and then up at the sky, trying to judge the wind from the movement of dust particles. Not a problem. Saying this, Shiva's attention returned to stringing his bow. Parshuram had been working on making this composite bow for months. Its basic structure was made of woods, reinforced with horn on the inside and sinew on the outside. It was also curved much sharper than normal, with its edges turning away from the archer. Due to the mix of different elements and the carve at the edges, the bow had exceptional draw strength for its smaller size. It was ideal for an archer to shoot arrows from while riding a horse or a chariot. Parshuram had named the bow Pinaka, after the fabled great ancient longbow of Lord Rudra. Though Parshuram didn't know this while designing the bow, the Pinaka would prove ideal for Shiva's purpose, as firing the Vayuputras Astra was not easy. The Vayuputras Astra was a pure nuclear fusion weapon, unlike the Brahmastra and the Vaishnavastra, which were nuclear fission weapons. In a pure nuclear fusion weapon, 2 Paramanus, the smallest stable division of matter, are fused together to release tremendous destructive energy. In a nuclear fission weapon, Anus, atomic particles, are broken down to release Paramanus, and this is also accompanied by a demonic release of devastating energy. Nuclear fission weapons leave behind a trail of uncontrollable destruction, with radioactive waste spreading far and wide. A nuclear fusion weapon, on the other hand, is much more controlled, destroying only the targeted area with minimal radioactive spread. So the Vayuputras Astra would be the obvious weapon of choice for those who intended to destroy a specific target with the precision of a surgeon. The problem, though, was its launch. The Daivi Astras were usually mounted on launching towers packed with a mixture of sulfur, charcoal, saltpetre, and a few other materials which generated the explosive energy that propelled the Astra towards the target. Once the Astra was close to its target, another set of explosions would trigger the weapon. The launch material within the tower had to be triggered from a safe distance, or else the people firing the Astra would be incinerated in the initial launch explosion. Keeping this in mind, archers were called upon to shoot flaming arrows from a distance to trigger the launch explosion. These archers usually use long bows with a range of more than 800 meters. To hit a target accurately from this distance required archers of great skill. The Brahmastra and the Vaishnavastra did not need a precise landing, as their destruction spread far and wide. Since accuracy was not of the essence, the launch towers that cradled these weapons had huge firing targets. The Vayuputras Astra, or weapon of the Lord of Animals, was a precise missile. It had to land at the exact spot. What complicated the issue even more at this particular time was that the attempt was to fire 3 missiles concurrently. The trajectory of the 3 missiles had been planned such that they would detonate over the Swarna, Rajat and Tamra platforms of Devagiri simultaneously, guaranteeing the complete and instantaneous destruction of the entire city. The risk with trying to destroy 3 platforms at the same time was that the inner circle of devastation would expand, since the weapons would have to be triggered from a greater height. Tara had planned the angles of descent of each missile such that together their simultaneous explosions would ensure the annihilation of Devagiri, while their excess energies would be trapped within each other, thus preventing any fallout destruction outside the inner circle. The precise descent needed a perfect takeoff. Therefore, the Pashupati Astra missiles had been set at precise angles within the tower. The target area on the tower where the fiery arrow would be shot was small. Shiva had to fire an arrow to hit the target, placed more than 800 meters away. Moreover, he had to do this while seated on a horse so that he could escape immediately after firing the arrow. "Remember, great Nilkant," said Tara, "the moment your arrow hits the target, you have to ride away. You will have less than 5 minutes before the Pashupati Astra explodes over Devagiri. You have to cover at least 300 kilometers within that time. Only then will you be out of the range of the minuscule number of neutrons from the Pashupati Astra which may escape that far." Shiva nodded distractedly, still testing his bow's draw strength. "Nilkant, it is crucial for you to ride as fast as you can. The blast can be fatal." Shiva didn't respond. He pulled out the arrows from the quiver. He smelt them and then rubbed the tip of one of the arrows against the rough leather of the pommel. The tip immediately caught fire. Perfect. Shiva threw the burning arrow away and returned the rest to the quiver. "Did you hear me? You need to move away immediately." Shiva wiped his hand on his dhoti and turned to Tara. "Right beyond the safety line now." "Shiva, you shoot the arrow and move." Shiva looked at Tara, his gaze glassy. Tara could see the blackish-red blotch on his brow throbbing frantically. "You will ride away immediately," emphasized Tara. "Promise me." Shiva nodded. "Promise me." "I have already promised you, now go." Tara stared at Shiva. "Nilkant." "Go, Tara. The sun is about to reach overhead. I need to fire the missiles." Tara pulled her horse's reins and spun it around. "And Tara?" Tara pulled up her horse and looked back over her shoulder. "Thank you," said Shiva. Tara was still, watching the face of the Nilkant with clouded eyes. "Ride back quickly beyond the safety line. Remember, all those who love you are waiting for you." Shiva held his breath. "Yes, my love is waiting for me." Tara kicked her horse into action and rode away. Shiva pressed his forehead right above the blackish-red mark. The pressure seemed to ease the horrendous burning sensation. The pain had been immense and continuous for the last few days, ever since he had seen Sati's body. Shiva shook his head and focused his attention on the tower. He could see the target in the distance. It had been marked a bright red. He took a deep breath and looked towards the ground. "Holy Lake, give me strength." Shiva breathed once again and looked up. "Lord Ram, be merciful." Arrayed in front of him was an army of clones, blocking his view of the Pashupati Astra launch tower. Clones of the giant hairy monster who had tormented him in his nightmares since his childhood. Shiva looked carefully and noticed that none of the monsters had faces. There was a smooth white slate where their faces should have been. All of them had their swords drawn, blood dripping from every single blade. He could clearly hear their ghastly roar. For a moment Shiva imagined he was a terrified little boy once again. Shiva looked up at the sky and shook his head as if to clear it. "Help me." Shiva heard his uncle Manubhu's voice call out. "Forgive them. Forget them. Your only true enemy is evil." Shiva brought his eyes down and looked his gaze on the launch tower. The monsters had disappeared. He stared directly at the red spot right at the center of the tower. Shiva pulled his horse's reins and turned it right, singing softly in its ear to calm it down. The horse stayed still, offering Shiva the stable base he needed to hit a target. He turned his head to his left, creating the natural angle for a right-angled archer to get a straight shot. He pulled his bow forward and tested the string once again. He liked the twang of the bowstring when it was pulled and released rapidly. It was as taut as it could be. He bent forward and pulled an arrow from the quiver. He held it to his side and looked up, judging the wind. The art of shooting arrows from this huge distance was all about patience and judgment. It was about waiting for the right wind conditions, the ability to judge the parabolic movement of the arrow, determining the ideal angle of release, controlling the speed of the arrow at release, deciding the extent to which the string should be pulled. Shiva kept his eyes fixed on the windsock, keeping his breath steady, trying to ignore the burning sensation between his eyes. The wind is changing direction. Pointing the bow towards the ground, Shiva nocked an arrow, the shaft firmly gripped between his hooked index and middle finger. The wind is holding. He ignited the tip by rubbing it against the leather pommel. Taut muscles raised the bow and drew the string in one fluid motion, even as his warrior mind instinctively calculated the correct angle of flight. Master archer that he was, he kept his dominant eye focused on the target. His left hand held the bow rock steady, ignoring the searing heat from the tip of the arrow. The wind is perfect. He released the arrow without hesitation. He saw the arrow move in a parabola as if in slow motion. His eyes followed its path till it hit the red target, depressing it with his force. The fire immediately spread to the waiting receptacle behind the target. The Pashupati Astra's initial launch had been triggered. "Ride away!" screamed Tara from the distance. "Baba, turn your horse around!" shouted Karthik. But Shiva could not hear either of them. They were too far away. Shiva kept staring at the rapidly spreading fire beyond the target, the pain within his brow ratcheting up once again. He felt as if the insides of his forehead were on fire as well, just like the launch tower. He pulled the reins of his horse and turned it around. He could see his troops far away. Beyond them, he could see his ship anchored on the Saraswati. Sati's body was stored in there. "She is waiting for me." Shiva kicked his horse. The animal didn't need much coaxing, as it quickly broke into a gallop. The fire within the launch tower finally triggered the initial explosion. The 3 Pashupati Astras shot out of their pods, the 2 that were directed at the Tamra and Swarna platforms taking off just a few milliseconds after the 3rd. That was because the target of the 3rd missile, the Rajat platform, was farther away. Shiva kept kicking his horse as it galloped faster and faster. He was just a few seconds away from the safety line. The missiles flew in a great arc, leaving a trail of fire behind them. Seconds later, they began their simultaneous descent into the city like giant harbingers of absolute destruction. "Shiva!" Shiva could have sworn he heard the voice that he loved beyond all reason. But it couldn't have been for real. He kept riding on. The Pashupati Astra missiles were descending rapidly. "Shiva! Shiva!" Shiva looked back. A bloodied and mutilated Sati was running after him. Her left hand was spewing blood in bursts, in tune with each beat of her pounding heart. 2 massive wounds were on her abdomen, gaped open as blood streamed out from them in a torrent. Her left eye was gouged out. Her burn scar seemed like it was on fire once again. She was struggling desperately, but she kept running towards Shiva. "Shiva, help me! Don't leave me!" An army of soldiers chased Sati, holding bloodied swords aloft. Each warrior was the exact likeness of Daksha. The area between Shiva's brows began throbbing even more desperately. The fire within was struggling to burst through. "Sati!" screamed Shiva as he pulled the reins of his horse. He was not going to lose her again. The horse balked at Shiva's anxious command and refused to slow down. "Sati!" Shiva desperately yanked at the reins, but the horse had a mind of its own. He was not going to either slow down or turn. The beast could sense the stench of death behind it. Shiva pulled both his feet out of the stirrups and jumped to the ground, the speed of his fall making him lurch dangerously. He rolled quickly and was up on his feet in a flash. "Sati! Sati!" The horse kept galloping ahead towards the safety line as Shiva turned around, drew his sword, and ran to protect the mirage of his wife. "Baba!" shouted Ganesh. "Come back!" The blackish-red mark at the center of Shiva's forehead burst open and blood spewed out. He ran desperately towards his wife, roaring at the army of Dakshas who chased her. "Leave her alone, you bastards! Fight me!" The 3 Pashupati Astra missiles simultaneously exploded. As planned, some 50 meters above the 3 platforms, a blinding burst of light erupted. Shiva's army and the Devagiri refugees shielded their eyes, only to be stunned by what they saw of their own bodies. Glowing and translucent, blood, muscle, and even bone were visible. They even saw a demonic flash within their bodies, an echo of the devastating blasts over Devagiri. Sheer terror entered their hearts. Almost immediately thereafter, 3 bursts of satanic fire descended from the heights where the 3 Pashupati Astras had exploded. They tore into Devagiri fiendishly, instantaneously incinerating all 3 platforms. The great city of the gods, built and nurtured over centuries, was reduced to nothingness in a fraction of a second. "Lord Ram, be merciful," whispered Ayurvati in absolute horror as she saw the massive explosion from aboard the ship that was carrying Sati. As the fire ripped through Devagiri, giant pillars of smoke shot up from the site of the explosions. As Tara had predicted, the energy blasts of the 3 missiles seemed to attract each other. All the 3 pillars of smoke crashed into each other with diabolical rage as thunder and lightning cracked through the destructive field. The unified pillar of smoke now shot higher, higher than anything that any living creature watching the explosion had ever seen. The smoke column rose like a giant and steeply inclined pyramid, and then it exploded into a massive cloud about 1 kilometer high in the air, and just as instantaneously the pyramid of smoke collapsed into itself, closeted permanently within the ruins of Devagiri. Shiva, unmindful of the terrible devastation taking place in front of him, kept running forward, his sword drawn, his brow spouting blood at an alarming rate. As soon as the pyramid of smoke collapsed, another silent blast occurred. As this blast of neutrons raced out, the sound of the initial explosion reached Shiva's army cowering behind the safety line. "Baba!" screamed Ganesh as he jumped from the platform he was on and raced towards his horse. The neutron blast was invisible. Shiva couldn't see it, but he could feel a demonic surge rolling towards him. He had to save his wife. He kept running forward, screaming desperately, "Sati!" His body was lifted high by the neutron blast wave. For a moment he felt weightless, and then the wave propelled him back brutally. His brow and throat were on fire, while blood spewed out from his mouth. He landed hard on the ground, flat on his back, his head jerking as he felt a sharp sensation on the crown of his head. And yet he felt no pain. He just kept screaming, "Sati! Sati!" Suddenly he saw Sati bending over him. There was no blood on her, no wounds, no scars. She looked just like she had on the day he had met her, all those years ago at the Brahma temple. She bent forward and ran her hand along Shiva's face, her smiling visage suffused with love and joy, a smile that always set the world right for him. She touched the crown of Shiva's head. The sharp sensation receded and was replaced by a calm that was difficult to describe. He felt like he had been set free. Strangely, his blue throat was not cold anymore. Equally strange was the realization that his brow had stopped burning from within. Shiva opened his mouth, but no sound emerged, so he thought of what he wanted to say. "Take me with you, Sati. There is nothing left for me to do. I'm done." Sati bent forward and kissed Shiva lightly on his lips. She smiled and whispered, "No, you're not done yet. Not yet." Shiva kept staring at his wife. "I can't live without you. You must," said Sati's shimmering image. Shiva couldn't keep his eyes open anymore. Sati's beautiful and calm face began to blur. He collapsed into a peaceful, dreamlike state. As he was descending the depths of consciousness, though, he thought he heard a voice, almost like a command. "No more killing from now on. Spread life. Spread life."